Thank you, everybody, for joining us today at ICFAC, the International Chinese Fine Arts Council. We hope to strive to provide a platform for Chinese diaspora voices. And about a month and a half ago, after we did our first webinar about COVID-19, post-COVID-19 racism in the Asian community, Jacqueline Kok reached out and said she was interested in developing this new program, Spaces of Exchange, and wanted to invite different artists from all over the world to have these discussions. And I said, that's a great idea. And so I'm really happy to introduce everybody to Jacqueline, and I'm gonna let her take it from here.
All right, thank you, Inez. So hi, everyone. Welcome to Spaces of Exchange inaugural session. My name is Jacqueline Kok. I'm the curator and creator of this program. So with us today, we have the two brilliant up-and-coming artists, Catalina Ouyang and Furen Dai. Before jumping in, I just want to give a brief background description of Spaces of Exchange and properly introduce our two guests. So Spaces of Exchange is an online initiative that was born from the need to create moments to allow for deeper understanding, learning, and unpacking through open discussion. During these times of extreme uncertainty, social media has become an outlet for the greater public, though I find that it's an outlet that sometimes can become a vacuum or a kind of echo chamber. So in thinking of the ways that we could combat this kind of social effect, I decided to create this program with ICFAC to bring together thinkers, artists, art professionals, etc., to discuss present issues like systemic racism, classism, failed capitalism, etc., while challenging the notion of care, especially online care. So Spaces of Exchange will feature a conversation between two art professionals moderated by myself. Ideally, no two participants are based in the same area. This time we have a bit of an exception because Catalina and Furen are both based in New York. But the idea of the project is to break this echo chamber, and specifically actually the micro echo chamber that happens individually. So by pairing art professionals who have different physical, experiential, psychological backgrounds to talk about topics related to Chinese-ness or what it means to be Chinese in different socio-political and geographical settings, we can help break this micro echo chamber. The format of the talk will be broken down into two parts. First, we'll be hearing from both artists for the first kind of 20-25 minutes before opening up to questions from the public. So today's session, we've invited Catalina and Furen to discuss and explore the revisionist capabilities of historical narratives, including myths and legends, and how both artists cite these stories in their works. Catalina is a Chinese-American artist by way of Northeast and Midwest suburbia. She has had numerous international and national solo, duo, and group exhibitions. Turning to mythologies and oral histories, literature, and open signifiers, she explores the interstices of subjugation, race, gender, and monstrosity through her sculptures, installations, film, and performance. Furen is a Chinese artist based in New York who has also exhibited her work nationally and internationally. Prior to her career in the arts, she worked as an interpreter. Her interest in language's central role in the interpretation of culture has anchored her artistic practice, as it's largely focused on her research on Nüshu, the world's only known language created for and used solely by women. So I want to start our discussion by asking a few questions. And the first question being, what aspects of the myths that you've used, you've both used in your art practice resonate with and are in dialogue with the broader systemic issues that you're critiquing? So in other words, why have you chosen the myths that you've chosen? And how does it kind of speak to the broader issues that we're currently facing?
Thanks, Jacqueline. I think for me, it maybe is not so much about like specific myths that I'm looking at, because I take a pretty like holistic approach to working through and parsing through like references, whether they are folkloric or literary or art historical. But I'm really interested in storytelling as a kind of like knowledge production and dissemination that kind of doesn't even like reject a more rationalist or empirical framework of organizing what we understand as knowledge, but kind of is able to sidestep it entirely. And I think there's a power to how these stories that have been passed down predominantly through oral tradition and have kind of transmutated in many modes of dissemination over time, allow us to tap into these kinds of like ancient or primordial wisdoms that rely more on a kind of understanding or belief that is grounded in the unknown or the kind of ineffable. So that's really meaningful to me, because I think in my practice and where it intersects with what could be called like critique or resistance, it's about kind of pushing against notions of concrete truth or any one truth existing. So turning to like the mythic and the speculative are ways for me to try to rupture those more indexical frameworks.
Furen?
Yes, I'm sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I agree. I'm also interested, I think, to provide the alternative way to tell a story. But I want to answer this question by first really thinking, like, how is myth generated? And because for me, I personally think myth is something that rooted in the reality, but also projecting it online. So when you think about the origin of a myth, that is very often actually embedded or in association with the history, with the human conditions, with the imaginations, the location, the space, and then the human conditions, as well as, just a lot of like unpredictable things. And that's how all these factors, they are contributed in generating a myth. And then when myth is being carried and then passing through generations, there's also this force of the invisible force, almost like a censorship, for example, where the things get shifted and then it's get rediscovered. And when myth being rediscovered or reaccessed, it's in a way like for us to activate this myth. So when you think, it can be interpreted in many different ways, like through symbols, through abstraction, through social studies, or anthropology, all kinds of ways. And for me as an artist, I'm thinking, I'm always interested in where the things, where the mix of the fictional with the reality. And especially like nowadays, we live in a world where probably the reality is more bizarre than fiction. And so for me, myth is another way, like to have this encrypted information where you can use humor, use satire to digest this reality. Yeah.
I think that's really beautiful that you guys both touched upon alternative knowledge. It reminds me actually of a passage that I read, because I'm reading Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider right now, and she talks about tapping into feeling in the erotic. And I'm just wondering whether you guys can touch upon maybe that, the erotic, and how that kind of links to alternative knowledge, and like you were saying, Catalina, not necessarily it's challenging, but not necessarily rejecting kind of empirical knowledge. Does the erotic relate to this alternative knowledge that you guys are kind of trying to seek and unpack and expose?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a certain point, I made a pretty conscious decision to move away from kind of like direct or what's the word, didactic critique. Because I didn't want to like reify the structure that I'm pushing against by kind of like inviting its toxic presence into my work. And so I think increasingly over the last couple of years, like I've really tried to center like an emotional and intimate and intuitive approach to, both like formulating conceptually my work, but also in the physical making process. And I think something that really resonates with me about myth, as it has to do with like Audre Lorde's formulation of the erotic, which also for me has to do with like the ecstatic, has to do with this like kind of like intense, like deep-seated desire to both like to know, to feel, and like to be heard somehow, and to understand the things that like cannot be understood, whilst knowing that like, it is not, grounded or like validated by this kind of like technologically sanctioned form of science, or this like modernist sanctioned form of science. It's about like, leaning into a kind of like embodied understanding that also embraces, as I said before, like the unknown. And I've actually, I'm in the middle of reading this book by a psychoanalyst, Andy Formentel, where she's like writing about, in praise of risk, basically. And she kind of like formulates risk as it has to do with like intense desire, and this like willingness to like put things on the line. And that sentiment also for me relates to the thing that creates this like desire for a more like spiritual understanding or engagement with the things we like do not know or like cannot see. And that kind of like choose to risk or choose to like engage with like the desire that is seated in like the most intimate, center of ourselves actually becomes like a form of like time travel, because in choosing to risk the kind of future, we're actually able to like renegotiate our relationship with the past. And so I think like in tapping into like folklore, myth, fairy tale, that's also the same kind of energy for me. Like when I, in my statement, I guess, like talk about like finding like new spatio-temporal formations, like I think engaging with these, multifaceted stories is also its own kind of like time travel in a way.
Furen, did you want to add anything about how Audre Lorde's concept of the erotic links to your understanding of alternative knowledge or tapping into alternative knowledge?
Yeah, I think I want to actually go back to what Catalina was talking about in the beginning. Most of the myths are passing down through oral history. And when you're talking about oral history, it's like you are projecting words through your mouth. And then it's like to another person's ear. And when you're telling about oral history, it's always where it's surrounded by people. Like there is a person who tells the story, and there's a group of people who listen to the story. And then passing by, then you start thinking there are people who are trying to retell this story, or trying to rewrite this story, or trying to censor the story. Then that becomes the manifesto of this myth. So I think this is another way where through this oral history to written language, and then through human engagement to the story too. And also I think I'm really resonate with what also Catalina just said, in terms of trying to really breaking down something that is impossible for us to understand to something that we are more familiar with, or we can recognize it in order to, but basically to breaking down things in order to understand them.
Yeah, I find that you guys were both talking about the unknown, the human engagement really at the core of things, and I loved, Catalina, when you talked about time travel and renegotiating with the past. But there was one thing that kind of struck me as specific, I guess, as something that I could relate to, which is that many of the subject matter in your work are drawn from Chinese folklore. At least for myself, when I see Furen, you're talking about the Nüshu, which is, you know, a language that's originating from Hunan. Catalina, I know in many of your works you've referenced, you know, for example, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So, you know, there's very specific kind of Chinese folklore that is present. And so as a Chinese Canadian curator, I can definitely, you know, recognize these stories, but I wonder, you know, a non-Chinese audience might not be able to recognize this. So how does your work speak to this broader audience? I know that you guys talk about kind of the human engagement in the human spirit at the core. And so in that sense, you know, it kind of transcends all boundaries, geographical, historical. But I do wonder, you know, how does a non-Chinese audience might relate to your work, or how does your work speak to a non-Chinese audience?
I think for me, like a big, you know, I always have like, you know, a handful of like considerations going into like making work, and you know, one of the foremost considerations is kind of creating an experience or an environment of honestly like visual pleasure, which I feel like in kind of like academicized like postmodern like artistic discourse is like so stigmatized, like, you know, beauty is bad, but like I don't think that beauty is bad, you know, and that's why I have so often, you know, like created installations with particular lighting conditions, even particular like temperature conditions that are, you know, like a little bit more immersive, and I always take great consideration into the actual way that bodies will and navigate through space, thinking about scale shifts and all of that. So, you know, regardless of whether the reference is legible, there will always be like some entry point for anybody to enter into. In terms of making the references themselves legible, I guess my take is that that's not really my concern. Like I'm not really interested in, you know, educating an outsider audience beyond what they might already recognize, because that, you know, is not really a kindness that was ever done for me, or, you know, and anybody else who occupies a minor position in the Western framework. Like I think when I first started working with Chinese folklore, like the first story that I was kind of taking up as a framework was Journey to the West. And I was actually thinking about like pop art at the time, and the kinds of like references that, you know, as a Western educated person, I'm expected to know. Like, you know, I'm supposed to know who Mickey Mouse is. I'm supposed to know who all these like old Hollywood actors are. I'm supposed to know, you know, who whoever the guy who wrote On the Road, Kerouac, just, you know, et cetera, right? And I was like, okay, like I want to make something that my Philistine, like Chinese parents can also like enter into. Like I want to make something that my hyper Philistine, like Chinese grandparents can also like find something in. And so that was kind of the decision that I made then. And it wasn't even about like choosing Chinese-ness, right? It was like about deciding to make the Chinese-ness of those references like a non-issue.
That's beautiful. That's kind of it's actually by breaking the categories and saying that, if I understand it correctly, it's kind of saying I don't want to highlight the Chinese-ness to make it kind of specifically Chinese, but rather by not kind of making that the primary subject matter, then it becomes something that opens up to everybody. No, I think that's a beautiful way to kind of allow for, like you said, different entry points. Furen, did you want to add something to, you know, to Catalina's, what she was saying?
Yeah, I definitely agree with different entry point to provide access for, you know, it's almost like you have this encrypted message where like there's an access point for everyone, that surface level knowledge where people can understand. But at the same time, if you dig deeper, there is this depth and complexity that is embedded in this work. If you're interested in going to to develop more or to study more or to learn more. Yeah, I think for me, it is the same. I feel like for a lot of projects, I very often conduct parallel research. So it is not only from one entry point for me to research about these things. So it's like several things goes back to back. Like for example, the Nüshu, the Secret Woman Language project that you mentioned in the beginning, is the project I did from 2015 to 2017. And why I found out about this language is really just because I'm interested in language. Mm-hmm. And then for this language originated from a hometown where it's very close to me, but I never heard about it. That just fascinated me. And also because I don't really have the access to this information. Or like, because how I found out about this is when I research about what kind of culture get really destroyed through cultural revolution. And that's when I found out about this language. And then when you really go deeper to study, there are probably like a dozens books that are written about this language. Mm-hmm. And when I think about it, it's fascinating to me that women created this language to passing all the knowledge. But when you actually go to the village to visit, the reality is like, it's very different than anything that is written in any books. And you have these women that are there being this live performer in order to perform this language for tourists. And that really tricks me to think it's not about only this language anymore, but also about like a cultural heritage status in general. Like the United Nations provide the cultural heritage status for different culture and what exactly it does to this culture. Mm-hmm. So I think when you look at the longevity of a project or like several projects of an artist, then you would start seeing sometimes the Chinese-ness is just acting as like one entry point because it's part of you. Then like you're also living in a different context. So you put several parallel lines together in order to make a project.
Mm-hmm. I think that also kind of like brings me into thinking about, you know, the kind of sticky territory that you get into with revision, right? Because like I kind of also entered into like revisionist takes on folklore, like through thinking about like Angela Carter's retellings of fairy tales. And that was a kind of like more old school, like feminist, like gender politic, you know, retelling of those stories. But also thinking about the kind of like second wave of predominantly white feminists who were, you know, like doing this whole like goddess feminist thing, like Judy Chicago, Nancy Sparrow. You know, artists who I still like find a lot of empowerment in, also find, you know, like deeply problematic. And so my understanding of like Nüshu and the villages in Hunan that like practice that is that like the kind of like contemporary feminist like retroactive read of that is like, oh yeah, it was like this like secret like subversive language. It was like, you know, against the patriarchy, you know, like they were like, you know, had this kind of like revolutionary capability, where as I guess like the limited scholarship that I read on it was that it was more kind of like a matriarchal form of like communication that, you know, had a place in the overriding like patriarchal society that it was plugged into, kind of the way, I mean, this is an extreme comparison, but in the way that foot binding was also shared as this like, you know, like sacred, like matriarchal kind of intimate act that at a certain point was not, you know, enforced directly by like the men in society. It was more like the mother, out of like her true love and care for the daughter, like had to bind the feet so that the daughter could like function in society. And so like I know that like Nüshu was often written like on fans as ways to like send messages between like women in a village and to other villages. Like there's this practice called Bao Tong, or like same, where girls would find a kind of like almost like spiritual soulmate in a different village, and until they became of like marriageable age, they would like write each other these, you know, Nüshu like love letters, and exchange gifts and stay at each other's houses. And this is a way really to like connect families together until like they were often like married into each other's families. So it was like almost like a form of grooming. So yeah, there's always like these complicated facets of things that, you know, today we can look back and see as like radical, but there's always like a more complicating factor to the practice. And I think it's also true, you know, for myths. Like we can look back at, you know, empowering like goddess myths, but there was, I think, one like not gendered, right, in the way that we understand. So many of these ancient deities are actually like pretty like gender fluid, androgynous, like or non-binary, you know, so it's hard to apply like a modern or contemporary like theoretical lens to them because they really resist that kind of categorization. So I think that's also really like exciting.
But I love that. I love that you, you know, in this way, kind of by talking about this, you know, the second wave kind of white feminist, without kind of bashing on them, but you know, that there it is problematic. You know, there is this idea of men coming in and you know, we hear a lot about this kind of white savior complex, and it's very much true for white feminists, at least in my opinion, that I see it that way. Oh, sorry, was someone going to say something? Sorry. Oh,
Sorry,
no.
you just froze.
Oh.
I mean, a little bit.
Okay. I'm working now, I hope. So yeah, I think it's kind of, you know, really interesting that you touched upon that, but then also looking at myths that really say, you know, we are resisting against kind of the you know, kind of the modernist modes of thinking. So I, you know, really think that was, you know, really interesting that you touched upon that. And I just want to kind of flow to kind of make this nice transition to see if there's any questions from the public, Q&A, and, you know, we're open now to having, you know, to asking public questions. But if we don't have any questions, you know, we can kind of keep this conversation going while we wait for questions. So it's, you know, I don't know if Furen, if you have anything to add to that while we're waiting for the public to send in their.
No, I don't really have anything to add on. I mean, it's just really interesting because when I find out about this language, and then when you read it, there's so many also different origins of this language too. And then they are like talking about, you know, women married into the emperor and how she's invented this language trying to communicate, or like a mother-daughter relationship, and also like the different forms of passing down this language too, like in fans, like through singing, through language or literature. And so it's really true that when I return to this village and then trying to say, oh, I want to see like how amazing this like woman power of this language, but then it turned out the reality is entirely different from what you are envisioning, like what do you expect you're gonna see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we have a question. I know Catalina answered already. So the question was, what's the name of the psychoanalytic book that you're reading? And the other question was, can you read a passage, one of your favorite parts from the book?
Yeah, so I'll just read the part that most directly relates to what I cited. So this is just like the intro. Risk is a kairos, in the Greek sense, a decisive instant. And what it determines is not only the future, but also the past, a past behind our horizon of expectation, where it reveals an unsuspected reserve of freedom. How should we name that which, in deciding the future, thereby reanimates the past, prevents it from becoming set in stone? Risk is akin to an acoustic phenomenon, a sort of feedback or Larsen effect that causes sound to return to its source. When a sound loops back, it provokes a kind of secret intelligence that alone, perhaps, is liable to disarm repetition. Far from being a pure onward bent on the future, risk subjects time and memory to an inversion of priorities through a sort of revolt, a very gentle and continual rupture.
Thank you. So there's another question as well for Catalina. You mentioned that you have a Western upbringing, or perhaps I did in the intro when I was talking that you came from Northwest suburbia. How did you learn about Chinese myths that you use in your artwork?
I even though I was raised in a suburb outside of Chicago, my grandparents raised me. They came over from China separately, spoke no English, couldn't drive, had no friends, and so I grew up bilingual. Sadly, I'm no longer, but so the cartoons and the stories that they were telling me as a child were all about Sun Wukong and Neja, and once they moved back, I also spent summers in China visiting them, and it's like the pop culture and like all the cartoons I was watching there were like Monkey King conquers the Dragon King and all of that. So I was like also thinking about like what is like a pop culture art practice or pop art practice that goes against what we understand from the U.S. in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it's funny that you mentioned Sun Wukong and kind of pop culture in Asia, because like yourself, I traveled many summers as a child back to Taiwan, and our frame of reference growing up is totally different. I mean, well, when I say our, I mean, in Taiwan, the kids that grow up there, they have a different understanding of what popular media is. But at some point, I realized that a lot of the images were imported from the West. So a lot of the images, so now everyone knows SpongeBob SquarePants. I mean, it's translated into, a million languages. And I thought that was really interesting. So I kind of wonder, and kind of just adding on to the question that our listener would asked, at what point does it merge for you? At what point is it no longer separate? This idea of what's popular in different geographies. At what point does it kind of become the same, or is it always in your mind kind of these two distinct places? If that makes any sense.
Well, I think it's not that like this rule that I gave myself that I was only going to start using references that my grandparents could understand. It's not that I got it out of my system, but it's like I had explored it to a certain point, and then I felt like, okay, like I can kind of start to dip my toes back into inviting a more holistic set of references into my work. And I think like one thing that really resonated with me was this quote from Ralph Ellison, where he was kind of responding to a lot of criticism about his writing, An Invisible Man, where I guess at the time there was a lot of backlash from other like Black authors about how he was like sullying the image of Black people by making this like violent protagonist as like a bad reflection like of people, and he said like you don't get to choose your relatives because they're who you're like born into, but you can choose your ancestors. And he was like, my ancestors are Hemingway, my ancestors are these other like white European authors, and I will like take from them and learn from them like what I need. And I thought that was like really poignant, right? Because it's like you can learn from anything without like censoring it as a kind of like idol. And so after that I started like going back to writers like Lispector and Jean Rhys, and just like white writers and other writers who I still think like resonate with my work, and I think I've like made my peace with them being able to like coexist.
Furen, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like for me, because I growing up in China and I moved here around like 7-8 years ago, and so it's actually interesting when you approach me with this talk, that I thought I never really think about my work dealing with the idea of myth, but when you really start thinking it, it's kind of shifting into different aspect. So for me, I think it's the same when you think about all these like Sun Wukong and all these myth or signify or stories or figures. You don't really think about that, but you more think about the actions that what he or she did in this myth that embedded in your culture and then become like a part of the way how you see things. So it become more abstract in a way. Like when you, when I saw you selected several pictures from my previous work, like the hair braid, and it's actually all embedded in some of the story, but it just become more abstract when you take it out and then become part of your daily life almost. Yeah.
So we have one question from a listener. Very long one. It's a 4-part question. I guess we'll go one by one. So with regards to what Catalina was saying about her interest in folklore / myths in general, as opposed to the specific myths. Oh, okay, so that's what I would be really interested to know how and why she goes about choosing myths. There are reasons that they were chosen. Okay, so I guess he wants to know why you chose the myths that you chose.
I mean, I think, you know, I kind of start with in a certain place and, you know, clues or, you know, portals take me to other places. Like, I think my process is pretty, like, associative and intuitive. You know, I think, like, again, like, the first story that I was working with was, like, Journey to the West, and at the time, honestly, I was also thinking about, like, the fairy tale Bluebeard. But, you know, eventually, like, as you, like, build up practice, you know, there are certain, like, launching points that it just makes sense to go into other things. Like, I think this one project I made that was kind of formulated around Nüshu, for instance, like, that for me started with me, like, reading through a lot of women Buddhist monks' poetry, you know, from, like, around 1000 BC, like, through the 1900s AD. And in, like, thinking about all this kind of discourse, poetic discourse around, like, reincarnation, that, like, kind of, like, triggered the memory for me, thinking about, like, Nüshu, who cut off their own head and, you know, was reincarnated as a lotus. And for me, that kind of, like, sacrificial trauma and regeneration made sense to work with as a framework for thinking about, like, sexual trauma and the kind of, like, contract of the body with its history, you know, possibility of kind of divergence from its a history of violence, perhaps. But yeah, I mean, and then sometimes, you know, I'll be in the middle of, like, making a body of work and won't realize until later, like, truly what I'm trying to, like, tap into. Like, you know, I started, like, carving stone in, like, 2016 and really, like, thought of it as a more meditative, laborious process. And it wasn't until, like, a couple of years later that I really started thinking about, like, myths of petrification, you know, kind of cross-cultural myths from, you know, the Gorgons of Greek mythology to like the waiting stones, like Aztec-Asian myths, and you know, the Indian myth of Ahalya, and all of these stories basically, like, had to do with punishment. So it was interesting to see that kind of divergence. So yeah, I mean, the process is pretty organic.
And it sounds like it's very liberal too. I mean, you don't confine yourself to kind of, I mean, when I say one myth, I'm talking about, like, one culture's myth, or, you know, you're really free to kind of think about all of these different stories that you've heard, which I kind of think is really, I mean, it's really liberating, you know, to not feel like you have to talk about the ones that you've only heard of. You can really kind of explore all the different stories that really touch upon, you know, a core, you know, there's a common thread, rather, I should say. There's a red thread that you can kind of link all these stories to. So I think that's really nice that you don't, you know, you're not confining yourself, and that, you know, people don't see your work as confined to one way of looking, so to speak, or one entry point, as kind of the words that you were using earlier. But the second part to this question is I'm really curious to hear about what the artists think about the construction of myth as opposed to logic. What about the connection between logic and myth? And this listener says, I think Furen touched on this. So Furen, would you like to kind of expand a little bit more on this connection between logic and myth?
I think a lot of people think like the nation or the state or institution should be built based on the like rations or logic or logos. But when you really think, I think they're allies in a way, I feel. I feel like the myth is where it is, can be understand, like a space for interpretation. And it is a place where you can use satire or use humor to critique, or without risk, without being risk in some countries.
Mm-hmm.
This is how I feel.
Catalina, any kind of, would you like to add on to logic, the connection between logic and myth?
Well, I think if I try to explain like what I mean about like embracing the unknown a little more, like I think it has to do with my sort of maybe like pessimistic view of like technology and, you know, accumulation in general. And, you know, obviously like I'm a 21st century creature who's like reaping all the awards of, you know, modern creature comforts, but it seems kind of like historically irreconcilable, you know, kind of things that like technological expansion and human progress, you know, have built themselves on, and the sacrifices that have been like inherent, like to people, especially like people in minor positions, and, you know, to the earth itself. And I think like these things have kind of happened in pursuit of like an absolute truth, like a truth that is like experimented, you know, sanctioned and validated, and this idea that like you can only know one thing or something. You know, I think for me, you know, science at a certain level requires as much faith as anything else, right? Like, do you see quantum physics? Like, fuck no. And so, yeah, you know, it's like my relationship with astrology, for instance, is that like, do I think that the moon and stars literally like affect like, you know, certain energy currents that, you know, then affect things that happen? Like, I don't know, maybe, right? Like, I guess like I'm deeply agnostic in that sense. And I really like advocate for myself, like this kind of agnostic approach to understanding or knowing anything.
Sorry, I just realized my room went dark. I'm just gonna turn on the lights. I was like, oh God. Okay, so I guess we can go to, there's 3 more questions, so I can, you know, try to go through all of them. The question is for you, Catalina, again. It's, you were talking about the works being accessible to a Chinese audience without giving consideration to the non-Chinese audience. How is it non-Chinese then? The listener says, I understand that it wasn't the point to teach non-Chinese audience, but how is your work non-Chinese when it is indexed as Chinese? And I'm assuming he's referring to index as Chinese as in, you know, talking specifically about the myths and being recognizable as Chinese. So how is it non-Chinese when it's indexed as?
Yeah, I mean, I guess without trying to be like too flippant, I don't think I have chosen not to think about it. You know, and I think from a more pragmatic standpoint, you know, it's like when I'm working with spaces and galleries that, you know, like have a Chinese collector base or predominantly Chinese audience, versus otherwise, you know, like they'll kind of like try to pull me in like certain directions. Right. They feel like you can sell your Chinese American identity because like there needs to be some kind of connection. So sometimes, you know, I'll try to accommodate or, you know, be strategic in that way. But in terms of like my own like intimate relationship with my work, like it's not really a consideration.
So it's kind of a cognitive choice to say, I'm not going to box myself in, really.
Right.
I understand, right. Okay, so let's kind of go through the last 2 before we finish off. So when we say revisionism in terms of myths, how is it so? Myths have evolved continuously throughout society. Which is the original myth, the all sort of go through different translations, and not only between cultures, but also between time. So how is it revisionist? How are myths revisionist? Yeah, if they're constantly evolving, which is really interesting, because I mean that's essentially saying, you know, that there's one myth, there's one source. We have to, you know, kind of stay true to that and think about that instead of thinking about all the, you know, the shifting or the possibilities that it does shift over time. So that's a really interesting question. How do you guys interpret a myth and the source, I guess you could say, of a myth? How do you guys, you know, look at that or find that?
Yeah, I really love this question because I guess it's not something that I've interrogated in this particular way before. I think like, so, you know, like one arguably like revisionist story that has had an indelible effect on my own practice was Anne Carson's novel and prose autobiography of Red. And, you know, the way I saw that as revisionist was that she was like taking the kind of myth of Hercules, you know, invading Gerion's island, killing all his sheep and then killing him simply because he's a red-winged monster. And transplanting that whole story to, you know, Gerion being like a little red-winged boy growing up in Kansas, little queer boy, and then Heracles being actually like the boy, this drifter who like breaks Gerion's heart, right? So it's like transfiguring the original myth into this contemporary, right, like retelling. So for me, it's like kind of like changing the kind of context or like environmental framework of the story. I think, you know, another potential of revisionism is, you know, like either like offering a different kind of ending to the myth, you know, where you're taking maybe like the villain. Right. Like I was really interested in like the white bone demon in the myth of Journey to the West, and how, you know, without explanation, she's just like posited as this like evil force, right? Simply because she wants, she's seeking immortality, right? Probably because she's had like a really hard life, right? So I was like highlighting her in a lot of my early pieces as protagonist. So there's that, like offering a different ending, and also, you know, in my more sculptural installation work, it's also about like arresting an ending and totally like fracturing the narrative, and then like reducing it to a series of signposts that then like expand into many different like spatial possibilities.
Furen, did you want to add on that and how you look at kind of myths that could evolve, that do evolve, the origins of a myth, and what you understand as revisionism in terms of myths?
Yeah, I don't really think, for me personally, I'm revisionism in a myth, but more of reinterpreting. And I liked what actually Catalina is saying about like to offering a different ending for this story, but also I think is looking at the situation, what has changed throughout the time, and then to do a projection for the future.
Yeah, I really liked that idea of offering a different ending, or even offering a different reading or way of looking at it. Actually, like you were saying, you know, different interpretation. Instead of looking as the villain, let's look at, you know, that character as from a different lens, from a different perspective, to give it that kind of. And it's not really even changing the myth. Rather, if I understand it correctly, it's simply kind of taking a different angle. And then kind of and unpacking that to the audience.
I think like speculating a different motive and kind of trying to introduce agency in places where it previously was not afforded.
Okay, so we have 2 questions left. We had one last minute one, but let's do the 2 questions. Furen, being a Chinese artist based in New York, have you found that you needed to adjust your practice so that it was accessible to audiences where you are? Do you see that as an additional labor owing to where you are, a Western country, or do you think this would be the same if you were based in China instead?
Yeah, I think there are definitely differences, but actually when I encountered the question would be the opposite, because there were people say, why don't you make your work in Chinese? And I think I somehow think that as an additional labor, because when you're in such a context and when you're talking and thinking in English, then you almost naturally doing this work in English subtitle. And then when people say, why don't you do your work in Chinese? So that's, for me, it's another layer of translating my work to Chinese condition, to Chinese language, and then translate back to English subtitle. So this is one thing. And the second thing, if I do the things differently, I definitely think I would make different works when I'm in China. Especially a lot of people are saying like, why you don't relocating to China? But I think a lot of works either is a little bit sensitive to the context of in China, especially from the perspective of how I make the analysis, and also just access for information is different too.
So our last question, although I have plenty more that I could kind of go on, talking about censorship and everything, but our last question is, what characters from Asian culture / mythology do you think are the most translatable for the likes of Hollywood? That's interesting. Because, I mean, we're, and I don't mean to kind of jump and answer the questions for you guys, but it's just, we were talking about myths, and in this way, talking about really the core aspect of a myth and not really looking at kind of one character and seeing that one character being somehow universal and I don't think that would be, I mean, it's a really difficult question to ask because it's really pinpointing kind of one, either antagonist, protagonist, and seeing how that fits into a different culture. And I don't know. I personally am kind of like stumped by that question. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I mean, no, don't be sorry, George.
Yeah.
I think I'm kind of a, I don't think Hollywood should be allowed to make anything, because they could take the most subversive character and like totally flatten it. I mean, even in like bigger like Chinese film productions, they've been doing like some contemporary retellings of The Monkey King, or there's like a new Nüshu show on Netflix, and like it's just all bad. Like it's like the kind of like binaristic formulations of like good and evil are like even more like polarized, because I guess they assume that contemporary art audiences are like just not very sophisticated. I don't know. So I kind of want to like protect all of these characters from this kind of treatment.
Furen, did you have a character that you feel that could cross over?
No, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't have an answer for that. But when you really think about like the question of what is Chinese-ness, I'm really thinking about that, and I think it's a different, it's about everything. It's about the way how I speak English. It's about the way how your relationship with your parents. It's about what do you eat, and all these things are embedded in part of the Chinese-ness. And I think that somehow all get translated in one way or another in different films or projects. And I couldn't really think of one specific mythology or Asian culture. And I mean, they have all the freedom to do whatever they want to do.
But I think we've already had it in Matt Damon starring in The Great Wall.
Yeah. And we don't have to get into that movie. It wasn't, I don't know, I didn't find it that great personally. So, I mean, that answers, we've gone through all the questions, fortunately within the allotted time. So, Inez is back to kind of wrap things up, but thank you so much for speaking with me, Catalina and Furen. It was such a pleasure. It really was.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Inez, for, giving us the platform.
Yes.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Jacqueline, Catalina, and Furen. I really enjoyed this talk because I feel like these are conversations that we may have amongst ourselves as Asian women, but it doesn't get, other people don't hear our conversations, and I think it's great that we can actually put it out there so other people can hear. And thank you everybody for joining us today, and we hope to do many more of these. So follow us on Instagram, Facebook, on our website. Come to us with ideas. We love your ideas and we want to put them on. So, so hope to see everybody soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.